All right, we're going to get started. Thank you again for joining us. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to our webinar titled Infrastructure, WIFIA and SRF Funding Overview, Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, and State Revolving Fund Programs. My name is Jessica Eckerlin from the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. Before we begin, we're going to go over a few logistics and then we can get started. During the webinar today, everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box anytime throughout the session. We will be saving your questions for a facilitated question and answer session at the end of the presentation. After the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording and other information you may need. This webinar has not been submitted for pre-approval of continuing education credits, but eligible attendees will receive a certificate of attendance for their personal record. To receive a certificate for this session, you must attend the entire session and register and attend individually using your real name and unique email address. Certificates will be sent via email within 30 days of the webinar date. If you have questions or need assistance, please contact smallsystems@syr.edu. All right, now for a little bit about us. The Environmental Finance Center Network provides training and technical assistance to small water and wastewater systems in all U.S. states and territories through our building technical, managerial, and finance capacity programs. If your community or utility needs assistance with drinking water or wastewater system management, please feel free to contact us through our request form, which I will be sharing shortly in the chat. The term technical assistance is used a lot, but not often defined. So here's a little more about technical assistance. As you can see, we provide a variety of services, including strategy support, planning and facilitation of training opportunities like this webinar today, to a wide range of audiences, including local governments and community organizations. So we've covered what technical assistance might look like, but we want to take a minute to discuss the expanded opportunities for EFC water technical assistance that exists because of the bipartisan infrastructure law. EFCs have been doing this work for decades, but in the wake of Bill, EPA and EFC have an evolving mission to expand access to the state revolving fund. The result of EPA expanding the EFC program with the specific aim of bridging the gap between community water infrastructure needs and increased funding through the bill. Much of that money is in the water space is coming through the SRFs, which we will be hearing more about today. For the next 5 years, the Environmental Finance Network and others around the country will be a source of additional free financial, managerial, and technical support for the region's municipalities, utilities, and tribes. The goal is to help communities access SRF funding for drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, all of the things that can be funded under the SRF. This slide illustrates the continuum of services offered by the EFC. We can assist with one specific need, such as helping others get to the starting line, or multi-year projects. We aim to ultimately bring motivated communities to the point of applying and securing funding for the project implementation. I've been primarily talking about the SRFs. However, the SRF may not fit your needs, and that's why we feel it's important to also spread the word about the Water Infrastructure Finance Innovation Act program, which is also included in today's webinar. We're very fortunate to have 3 fantastic speakers lined up for you today. Dallas Shattuck is a senior program manager for the US Environmental Protection Agency's WIFIA program, where she focuses on program processes, policy, and stakeholder engagement. Previously, Dallas spent over 4 years working on the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund team at the US EPA. With our next speaker, Bradley Rozycki, is a financial analyst with the United States Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water. Bradley has served as a member of the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund branch since 2018, where he helps with program implementation, technical assistance, training, oversight, and outreach engagement. Previously, Bradley worked with the Department of Labor as a Presidential Management Fellow. Our third speaker is Allison Souders. She's a financial analyst with the United States Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Wastewater Management. Allison has served as a member of the Clean Water State Revolving Fund branch since 2017, where she helps implement and evaluate the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and provides technical assistance to EPA regional offices. And on that note, we can get started, and I'll go ahead and hand over the presentation to Dallas.
Okay, perfect. Looks like it's okay. Hi, everyone. I'm going to kick off the presentation today. Again, my name is Dallas Shattuck. I'm with the WIFIA program at EPA, but I spent many years with the Drinking Water SRF program and worked a lot with the Clean Water SRF program. So I'm very excited to talk about both of these today. Okay, so to start with the WIFIA program, I want to talk about some of the high-level features to get things started. So for the WIFIA program, we have a minimum project size for the majority of our projects. That minimum project size is $20 million, and for those borrowers, we can fund up to 49% of their eligible project cost. So if you come to us, you have a $20 million project, for example, we could fund up to just under 10 million of that project for you. It's a little different for what we call small communities, and those are defined for our program as populations of 25,000 or less. So for the communities of that size, that minimum project size actually drops down to $5 million, and we can fund actually up to 80% of your eligible project costs. So if you have a $5 million project, we could fund up to $4 million, or $8 million of a $10 million project, for example. In terms of the repayments, so we can offer loan terms of up to 35 years after substantial completion of the project. So that's not when you sign the loan, that's not during construction, that is after the project construction is complete. And so for a lot of our projects that have construction windows of 3 to 7 years, that's actually around 40 years from the time they sign the loan to the time that all of their repayments are due. So that's actually a really big advantage of the WIFIA program, is that really long repayment window. For WIFIA borrowers also have the option of deferring repayments up to 5 years after substantial completion of the project. So again, that's not once the loan is signed, so you could sign the loan, do 3 to 5 years of construction, and then also defer all your payments for 5 years in order to raise rates, pay off other debt, get things in order so you're in a better place to be able to pay off the WIFIA financing. And something I will add to that is that after that 5-year period, you do have to start making payments, but you can make interest-only payments for several more years at that time. And it'll depend on who the borrower is and what type of repayment structure they come up with their WIFIA transaction team. But we do have a lot of borrowers who will defer for 5 years, start making interest-only payments at that 5-year mark after their project's done, and then several years after that, we'll start doing principal and interest payments. The interest rate is going to be equal to the Treasury rate, and that is determined on the day of closing. So when you come into us, we can tell you maybe what the interest rate is today, but that's not going to tell you what your interest rate is going to be, because we determine that on the day of loan closing. I think I looked last week, it was maybe like 4.25%, but again, that's going to change depending on the day that you would close your loan. I'm going to go to the next slide because it kind of talks about some of these more. Okay, so for eligibility, I want to start by talking about like who is eligible. And for WIFIA, it's really a wide range of public and private entities. So we can fund local, tribal governments, water systems, public-private partnerships, JPAs, corporations, trusts. We can even provide loans directly to the state revolving fund programs as a way to kind of supplement the funding that they have available for water systems in their state. In terms of the types of projects, it's really anything you can think of, drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, infrastructure related, which is what we can fund. So we do a lot of projects that are modernizing aging infrastructure, helping with regulatory compliance, improving water quality, or public health benefits, addressing the impacts of climate change. It's really anything, again, that you can think of water infrastructure related. And for activities that are eligible under the loan, it really ranges from the more conceptual stage, the planning and design, the pre-development work for the project, all the way through construction and those associated costs. And we also do have the option to do planning and design only loans, which is something that we started recently, and we have done a few planning and design loans over the past year. So on this slide, I'm not going to go through all of these, but we will be sharing the slides later. So I wanted to make sure that you had this full table. This kind of covers just some of the features and benefits that we like to talk about when we talk about WIFIA financing, because it's not just about the interest rate. And especially in the current interest rate environment that we're in, interest rates have been better, just putting it bluntly, but there are still a lot of benefits to the WIFIA program that make it an attractive financing option for communities. So again, that interest rate, it's going to be decided on the day of loan closing. It's going to be a fixed interest rate. And one thing that is not on this slide, but that I like to talk about, given the current interest rate environment, is that borrowers do have the option of doing what we call a one-time interest rate reset. And so if they meet a few requirements, I can share, we have a fact sheet that talks about it. There are certain conditions they have to meet. Let's say in a few years, you close a loan and then interest rates go down a few years after that during construction. You want to do your one-time interest rate reset. That is an option for you to lock in a lower interest rate. Interest is not going to start accruing until you draw down on the loan. So similar to the SRFs, the WIFIA program is a reimbursement program. So you do the construction or the planning and design, you incur the costs, and then you would submit invoices to us that are either paid or are approved to pay. So you don't have to pay them before you submit them to the WIFIA program. And then once we process those and send you your reimbursements, then you would start accruing interest just on the portion that you drew down, not the entire loan. So that is another benefit of the program. You're not going to start accruing interest when you sign the loan. It'll probably be a few years until you start accruing interest once you get to construction and submitting those receipts. And borrower credit does not impact the interest rate. So the WIFIA program does require an investment grade rating. So that's BBB- or higher. But a borrower who is, let's say, BBB- or higher, or sorry, BBB-, we funded borrowers that have that that credit rating, they get the same interest rate as an entity that's like AAA. It only depends on what day they're closing and what the interest rate is at the federal interest rate. So that is a huge benefit to some of our borrowers, and they get a much lower interest rate than they would on the bond market. There's no penalty for prepayment. We often do sculpted repayment schedules. We can do typical mortgage style. Some of our borrowers want to do that, but a lot of our borrowers like to do customized sculpted repayments to grow them over time. And like, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but like wrap it around SRF debt or maybe some of their bond market debt. Financing, we can combine several projects and fund them all under one loan in certain situations. We also have the ability to do something that we call a master agreement. And so say you have several projects, maybe like a capital improvement plan, several projects that you need to complete over like a 10-year period. If you can submit those to the WIFIA program and say they're worth $400 million, again, we can fund like half of that. So maybe we'll say we can make a master agreement with you that we will provide you $2 million, $200 million, excuse me, over the next 5 years toward your CIP projects. And then you would come in over the next 5 years as those projects or groups of projects are ready to go to construction. You would come in for smaller loans that would equal up to that $200 million. A lot of our borrowers like this, it just gives them funding certainty for a lot of these huge projects that they're trying to take on and pull funds together from various resources. So having that upfront commitment from the WIFIA program kind of helps them plan ahead. I do want to mention small borrowers. Again, for the WIFIA program, it's $25,000 or less. That's a little different for the SRFs, and I'm sure they're going to talk about that. So some of the ways that we can help small borrowers are things that we have implemented. Again, we can cover up to 80% of your eligible project cost. Typically, that's that 49% for communities over 25,000. We also have that smaller minimum project size, 5 million versus 20. We also have lower application fees. So, and we call them application fees, but it's really a down payment or a deposit on your closing costs. So you pay it when you submit your application, but then when you get to loan closing, it's going to go towards your closing costs. And it can all be financed as part of the loan. So for small communities, it's $25,000 versus the typical like application, like the down payment of $100,000. And there are also opportunities for technical assistance. I'll talk about this more later, but we have like a loan origination process where we have like some dedicated staff members and contractors that can kind of answer questions about applications and help you get ready to like submit successful applications. I just want to quickly highlight 2 projects that might be of interest. One is in New York. So in Cortland, we funded the $16 million project that helped them upgrade their 100-year-old water and sewer infrastructure. They are, by the WIFIA program's definition, a small borrower, and using the WIFIA program saved them a little over $3 million compared to the bond market. This is a project in Massachusetts, so Springfield Water and Sewer Commission. They also bundled a bunch of drinking water, wastewater, and energy efficiency projects, a $250 million loan. They took advantage of a lot. They did the loan deferment period. They did a flexible repayment plan. They also locked in a lower interest rate. This loan is a few years old. And then by their estimates, locking in all of that financing, when they did, is going to accelerate updating their system by 15 years and save them around $60 million. So how do you get started? So the WIFIA program, the loan process is divided into 3 phases or 3 stages. And so the first one we call project selection, and that is where you would submit what we call a letter of interest. It's not an application. It's not a full application. It's a document that kind of tells us more about you, more about your project, and about your credit. And that's kind of what we're looking at. We're looking to see, is this eligible? Is it something we're even allowed to fund under the law? What does your credit look like? Can you pay, can you pay back a loan? And technically from like an engineering perspective, is this project feasible? And if those things all kind of pass the check that we're doing, we will do what we call invite you to apply. So like your project will be selected. We will send you a letter, like an email memo that's kind of inviting you to apply for the program. You're not obligated to apply. There's no cost to submitting a letter of interest. Just if you want to learn more about WIFIA, learn if you are eligible to get financing, that would be your first step. Then the second step in that process would be submitting your application and getting to the loan closing process. And at the beginning of this stage, that project approval process, that's where there will be those opportunities for technical assistance, pre-application support by one of our like dedicated staff members and some of our contract support to kind of talk through the requirements, help you navigate that application process. And then after we get to loan closing, we have that third step, project monitoring. There's still a lot of work that's got to happen once the loan closes. We still have to construct the project, submit the reimbursements, process those, and then repay the loan. And so that is the third step of the process. And on this slide, I just want to talk quickly about time frame. So one of the questions that we're asked most frequently is, well, if I submit an application, how long does it take to close the loan? And the high level answer is really it depends on how complex the project is, how complex the borrower is. Are you a public utility? Are you a P3? Are you another private entity like a corporation or a trust? That's going to impact things. But we typically estimate 4 to 9 months. That is on average like how long our loans take. They can be longer than that though. Sometimes borrowers want to move at a slower pace because they're timing it with other funding, and that is totally fine. We work at your pace. And there are some things like in this table that can kind of tell us if it'll be like a faster or a longer loan closing. So projects that are, a bit further along in design, 30 to 90%, or if you haven't started planning and design yet, could be longer. If the environmental review, like the studies required for that and the consultations have already started, that's going to help move that process along quicker than maybe if that hasn't happened yet. We have environmental staff on the WIFIA team who will do the environmental reviews. But depending on how much work has done before you've come into WIFIA will kind of determine how long it will take them to work with you to get through that environmental review process. Okay, so the WIFIA program has funding available on an ongoing basis. We're always open. We say we're like a bank. We do receive money every year from Congress. It just kind of helps us replenish the fund, so we're able to keep providing money every day on an ongoing basis for a variety of people, a variety of borrowers, small and large. And because we're open all year round, that first step in that process, again, that letter of interest submission, you can do that at any time. Again, year-round access to the program. You get quicker decisions from us now that we're not in the competitive environment, which is how we used to do it. So once you submit your letter of interest, we estimate 6 to 8 weeks until you get a decision. Many times it's quicker than that if there's nothing that we need to come back on or questions that we have, but we say 6 to 8 weeks. You can time it with other cycles of funding like the SRFs. They all have their own cycles, some year round, some not. And since we're not in that competitive environment, like we can provide more assistance to you in that process. Like we can talk about things you have questions about. We can ask you if something's not clear. If you're missing documentation or like one of the files you submit's like not working, we can ask you to fix that or talk with us about it. And so the way that you do that is really easy. You just email wifia@epa.gov and ask for access to our SharePoint site, which is where you would upload everything. I think, okay, this is my last slide. I just want to end with, if you want to learn more, I'll start with office hours because we host them every month. I think it's the second Wednesday of every month. We actually have some tomorrow at 3 o'clock. So I will be there with one of our underwriters. We have like a short presentation if people are interested. We also just sit there and people ask us questions. If they are working on a project, they know about WIFIA, they just want to answer questions. So say you leave this webinar today, you think of other questions, feel free to pop on that tomorrow or any other month. We're also always happy to do one-on-one meetings, whether it's with the prospective borrowers, sometimes it's the consulting engineers or the financial advisors. Anyone who's interested in meeting with us, we're always happy to do so. So if you just want to email, you can email wifia@epa.gov and we'll get that scheduled. My email is also on the last slide. You can email me and we'll set something up. So yeah, I will just end there. If you want to set something up, wifia@epa.gov. And now I will turn it over to Brad and Allison.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Dallas. I will be kicking it off for the state revolving funds at EPA. My name's Allison Souders. I work for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, but I'll start with a quick overview of the gist of both programs here. So what are the state revolving funds? So the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and the Clean Water State Revolving Fund are federal state partnership programs that provide funding and financing to eligible assistance recipients for water quality improvement projects for the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. This means funding and financing for public water systems for drinking water infrastructure projects and activities, with a few caveats that Brad will talk about a little bit later. And for Clean Water State Revolving Fund, we provide funding and financing for wastewater, stormwater, and other eligible water quality improvement projects. So all states and Puerto Rico each have their own clean water and drinking water SRF program, and those are capitalized annually by a grant from the US EPA. The federal capitalization grants that we provide are then matched by the states at 20%. Again, that's matched at the state level, so we don't have a project match. And then interest earnings provide the annual funding available for SRF assistance agreements and projects. Some states raise additional project funding by leveraging their program by selling bonds. And the assets of the program provide security and repayment for the bonds. So the next slide is a little overview at the state level. The states provide these below market loans and other authorized assistance to eligible recipients for water infrastructure projects. The loan terms, we'll just see on another slide, the loan terms for each program, typically between 20 to 40 years. The primarily low-cost interest loans are awarded to borrowers for eligible DWSRF and CWSRF projects. Over time, those borrowers make loan repayments to the state fund, and those repayments are made available for future assistance agreements. And that's the recycled funds to make additional loans, and the revolving cycle continues in perpetuity in each state. So the next slide is just kind of an overview, a visual of that. The partnership, really, the federal funding going in with the state funding to provide a revolving source of perpetual funding for water quality improvement projects in each state, according to their own priorities and statutes. So the next slide is just kind of an overview of the benefits that you can see with SRF, Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund financing. So the assistance options deliver significant benefits to borrowers, primarily low interest loans from 0 to market rate. The SRFs offer extended loan terms up to 30 years, or 30 years for clean water or 40 years for drinking water SRF, with options for extended or tailored loan structures, often in many states, working with projects to see if there are ways to benefit both the program and the borrower with tailored structures. Repayments begin up to 12 months after project completion, or 18 months for drinking water SRF, and can cover the entire cost of the loan. The SRFs serve a diversity of communities, all sizes and socioeconomic statuses. I can speak for CWSRF. The loan sizes range tremendously. In 2022, the smallest SRF loan, CWSRF loan, was for only $2,300, and the largest was for $666 million, a loan to New York City for pretty much a large portion of their capital improvement plan and a bundle of projects. So that kind of showcases the flexibility of the programs. There's also technical assistance options in many states and at the federal level, and the ability for SRF funds to co-fund or match other funding sources. Like you heard, WIFIA can only fund a certain amount of a project, so the Clean Water Drinking Water SRF will often step in for the rest of that. And another interesting tool is using SRF funds to provide cost share or project match for eligible projects that are funded by another program, like a grant. For instance, CWSRF programs have provided grant match for the cost share for non-point source 319 project grants. So there's a lot of different ways to leverage this financing for water quality infrastructure improvements. So the next slide is just a graphic of the general SRF application process. So like I mentioned, each state in Puerto Rico has their own drinking water and clean water state revolving fund program, and each of those will have their own SRF application process. They will have their own intended use plans each year describing what types of projects they're going to be funding. So it's really important to contact your state SRF program as early in the process as possible, just to get an idea about eligibility, when their applications are due, and anything that might be relevant for your project, or just what you're looking to solve in your community. For instance, states go through a project ranking process, and it is pertinent to talk to them to learn about any of the priorities in the state that you might want to highlight in your project to give yourself a boost in that process. So the next slide is who is eligible to come for Clean Water State Revolving Fund dollars. So potential Clean Water SRF borrowers must meet certain criteria to eligible to apply. But in general, CWSRF programs may provide assistance to public, private, or nonprofit entities for water quality projects. Eligible recipients vary by project type and include municipalities, utilities, state agencies, community groups, farmers, homeowners, small businesses, conservation districts, and nonprofit organizations. But you'll notice there is an asterisk here on many of these categories because in all 51 Clean Water State Revolving Fund programs, each one may not fund necessarily those ones with the asterisk here. So that's another important reason to reach out early to check if you are eligible, and if not, start thinking about partnerships that you could make with maybe an eligible borrower or borrower type. Next slide is just what types of projects are eligible to be funded by the Clean Water SRF. There are 12 statutory project eligibilities, and these include what is covered in this and the next slide. In general, the construction of publicly owned treatment works, the implementation of a state non-point source management plan and what is on those plans, excuse me, decentralized wastewater treatment systems, septic tanks, stormwater management, water and energy efficiency projects, and more are eligible for Clean Water State Revolving Fund. Again, that will and may and will vary by state program because they have their own priorities and maybe different programs for those. So it is important to talk to them as soon as you're interested in financing. The next slide, I think, is just some more of those eligible project areas. You'll notice watershed pilot projects, planning. There is really truly a broad spectrum of eligible Clean Water SRF projects that aren't just treatment plant updates and upgrades. There's a lot of like land conservation, agricultural BMPs, energy efficiency, water reuse going on as well. But it's important to remember that the SRF, while we can fund capital projects as well as planning and design, but the SRFs are not able to fund ongoing operations and maintenance activities. And I believe that is my last slide, and now Brad will take it over for the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund.
All right. Thank you, Allison. This is Brad Ruseski. I've been a financial analyst with the Drinking Water SRF since 2018. So diving right in, who's eligible to use the DWSRF funds? Both public and private community water systems, as well as nonprofit, non-community water systems such as schools and parks. And then about the types of projects. So I also wanted to mention here, similar to what Allison said about clean water, drinking water can also cover a large range of projects. In FY22, the smallest drinking water loan was for $1,140, while the largest was for $274 million. So with the size of the loan and the variety of projects, a lot of flexibility with the program. So for the projects, historically, transmission and distribution, along with treatment, have been our most funded project types. But we also fund consolidation and creation of systems, storage, and even the planning and design of these projects. So a unique and essential part of the drinking water side of the program that makes it a little different from clean water is what we call set-asides. Set-asides are intended to support activities necessary to ensure safe and affordable drinking water, to provide states with flexible tools to assist water systems and improve public water health protection, to extend and enhance the impact of DWSRF funding, and to sustain the day-to-day operation of the state's drinking water programs. And we'll, of course, be going into more details. The set-aside should complement infrastructure financing, strengthen the public water system supervision program, and also implement the 3 preventative programs, the capacity development, operator certification, and a source water protection. So states are able to take up to 31% of their cap grants for set-asides. This 31% can consist of 4% for admin, 2% for technical assistance to small water systems, 10% for state program management, and 15% for local assistance such as source water protection. So set-aside eligibilities are activities that help achieve compliance with regulations or furthers public health. Something to keep in mind, however, is if an activity is eligible for the loan program, it is likely not eligible for a set-aside. Of course, there's always exceptions to the rules, as you can see on the slide, for project planning and design costs. So here we have some of the more common examples of how set-asides are used. I won't read through them all, but a couple to point out is the staff funding under the 4% admin set-aside. That's a common one that our state SRF partners use, and then also the training for operators for small systems, which is under the 2%. So I'm gonna shift gears and start talking about the bipartisan infrastructure law. The law represents an historic investment in many key programs, including the single largest investment in water by the federal government, an increased investment in disadvantaged communities, and an effort to support American workers. On this slide, you see a breakout of the $43.4 billion by appropriation and by year. We're going to go into more specific details in the next few slides. Bill is providing nearly an additional $13 billion in funding for clean water projects. Notably, Bill created a new eligible use for the CW SRF. States may use up to 2% of the funding to provide technical assistance to rural, small, and tribal publicly owned treatment works. This is similar to the drinking water 2% set aside that we talked about a couple slides ago. On the drinking water side, nearly $31 billion was made available in additional funding with a focus on emerging contaminants and replacement of lead service lines. Oh, sorry, Dallas, can you go back one more? Thank you. The lead service line replacement appropriation is the largest of the 5 pots of money provided by Bill, with $15 billion over the course of the 5 years. One of the challenges with this effort is the communities determining if they have lead service lines, and if so, where they are located. To assist in this challenge, these funds could be used for inventories along with the replacement of the lines. All right, how to apply. So when applying, what we recommend is identifying your needs first. Go in with a plan, and then as soon as you have that plan, you know your needs. That's when we would encourage you to engage early with your state SRF program. They're more than willing to work with you to provide you with what you need. And the earlier you start this process, the earlier you can get onto their intended use plan, which is the first step for them awarding you the funds. And as we note on the bottom, while the bill fundings is a large chunk of money, they only go up until 2026, but the base SRF program is ongoing. So even if you miss the window in a few years for bill funding, there's still reach out to your state SRF. There's still plenty that they can do to help you. So with that, I think we're going to go back to Dallas.
Yep, it's me again. Thanks, Brad and Allison. So I am going to finish things off here now that we've kind of talked about what WIFIA is and what WIFIA does in both SRFs and what they do, kind of how the programs compare to one another and how they can be used together. Okay, and so before I even go through this slide, I want to make the caveat, and anytime I talk about both programs, I make the caveat. The WIFIA program, it's one program run at EPA from a federal level. The SRFs, I think you've heard Allison and Brad say there are 51 drinking water SRFs and there are 51 clean water SRFs. So there are 102 SRFs across the country. They all have the same basic framework, but they are all different. And so some of these statements are in trying to compare one national program to 102 programs, that can be kind of difficult. So that's why you'll see typically or could be, just a caveat that I like to make. And so kicking things off, approximately half of the WIFIA program's projects are also receiving SRF co-funding. One of the things that WIFIA can do is help finance some of those larger clean water or drinking water projects, especially with Bill. Like Brad kind of talked about all of the money that's coming through Bill. There are a lot of communities that have contacted their state programs. They're very interested in the Bill funds, especially the opportunities for those grant-like dollars that the states are giving out. But sometimes states, SRFs just don't have enough funding. It's a finite amount of money. They don't have enough funding to give everyone who comes to them the full amount that they're asking for, especially if they do get requests for very large loans. And so one of the things that the WIFIA program has helped state SRFs with and is continuing to talk about, especially with all of the bill money that has come in, is helping co-finance some of those large requests that the SRFs are receiving, where they might not be able to fund the full project. And something that's also useful to keep in mind, again, it depends on the state. There are some states, especially with Bill and the very high demand, that they've had to impose funding caps in certain situations. That way they're able to spread the money out amongst as many communities as possible. Whatever that amount is, whether it's 15, 20, 25, 50 million, depending on the state. A lot of states have had to implement caps, so they're able to fund as many communities who need help as possible. Again, like we've mentioned, the WIFIA program, we can only fund up to 49% of your project cost. So $100 million project, we can only fund 49 million of that. The other 51 million has to come from somewhere, whether that's cash that you have on hand, the bond market, the SRFs, which is, I think, our most common co-funder. That's where the other 51% has to come from. And so the SRFs have been great partners with WIFIA in helping us co-fund an entire project. So we will do the 49%, and the SRFs in certain situations can do the entire remaining 51%, or maybe they're doing a portion of that 51%, and they're another piece of that puzzle in addition to like cash or maybe bond market to get the entire project funded. I've talked about this before. One of the benefits of the WIFIA program is that we typically are offering very customized, flexible repayment structures that are like tailored to the borrower. We can do mortgage style. Some of our borrowers do that typical, you pay the same amount every 6 months for 30 years. But that's not common for our program. I think that is more common for the SRF programs. And so kind of co-funding projects and having a more like flexible repayment schedule with a more mortgage style repayment schedule kind of lets borrowers put the funds together and kind of repay them however works best for them. We've talked about loan repayment terms. Again, the WIFIA program, it's 35 years after substantial completion of the project. And for the SRFs, it's going to be between 20 and 40 years, depending on which SRF. And they have certain eligibilities for if you are, the terminology is disadvantaged community. But it is up to the state whether they allow loan terms to go up that high. Maybe if Brad wants to speak to this later on, I don't think it is common that there are a lot of 40-year loan terms for the drinking water SRF. Maybe that's changed. But again, the purpose of the SRFs is to loan the money out, get it back in the fund, so then they can give that money to more communities to help them with their infrastructure. For the WIFIA program, we loan the money, it goes back into the treasury. There's not really a revolving component. And so we are more than happy to kind of extend the repayment as long as we can, be flexible on it, and kind of wrap around that SRF debt. So borrowers can do minimum WIFIA repayments, pay off the SRF, and then worry about WIFIA 20 years from now. And one of the things that we do, we're always working to kind of streamline this process when we're working with, you know, individual state SRFs, is to streamline and, you know, try to eliminate the duplication of effort with a lot of the federal requirements, because WIFIA and SRF, they have like the same cross cutters, like American Iron and Steel, Build America, Buy America, and the environmental process. So working together as much as we can to process waivers, share environmental review documentation, so we're not reinventing the wheel, and making it as easy as we can for borrowers. Okay, I made this comparison chart again, comparing one program to 102 programs. So do with that what you will. For the WIFIA program, we've closed 120 loans. The average interest rate is 2.5%. For last year, for both SRFs, their interest rate was 1.25%. But again, each SRF has their own interest rates, some as low as 0, some can't do 0, all the way up to market rate. So it really depends on the state. Brad and Allison talked about their loan ranges. For the WIFIA program, in that same time period, we've done 13 million to 477 million. 13 million is the lowest that we have done historically. We can do lower. That is just the lowest we've done. The highest we've done throughout program history is like $720 million. And we currently have some projects that are over $1 billion in process. Repayment terms, again, 35 for WIFIA, 20 to 40 for the SRF, depending on which SRF, if you're designated economically stressed or disadvantaged community, and what the SRF's like caps on loan rates are. EPA allows up to 30 or 40 years. That doesn't mean the state has to offer up to 30 or 40 years. Repayments, 5 years for WIFIA, 12 or 18 months for the SRFs, depending on which one. Both SRFs are able to offer grant-like dollars, that additional subsidy term that you probably saw on the slides. The WIFIA program does not have that authority. Repayment structure, again, WIFIA is typically more flexible and customized, but the SRFs can also, they're also able to do that if they choose. The one thing that we haven't specifically mentioned that is on this slide that I want to talk about is this federal funding cap. So for WIFIA programs, or sorry, excuse me, for WIFIA loans, the law says that a WIFIA project can only be funded up to 80% with federal funds. So let's 100 million, because that's just easy math for my brain. Only up to 80 million can be federal funds. So like WIFIA, maybe USDA, FEMA. Where the SRF comes into this is that some SRF dollars are federal, but a lot of them are not. And so that's one of the things that we always keep in mind when we're doing co-funded projects, but that is also one of the benefits of co-financing with WIFIA and the SRFs, is that there are opportunities under the SRFs to co-fund, and the SRF funds not be counted as federal funds. And so that is something to keep in mind. Again, we've co-funded dozens of projects together. It hasn't really ever been an issue. We're always able to work with the SRFs and kind of figure that out. Just a couple co-funded examples for you all that I thought might be of interest. So in Tacoma, Washington, they received 31 million between WIFIA and the Clean Water SRF to update their electrical system for their wastewater treatment plant, you know, preventing untreated wastewater from spilling into the nearby river in case there was like an electrical failure. In Orange County, also, they received a lot of WIFIA and Clean Water SRF funding for this like water reuse project. They did groundwater replenishment to decrease their reliance on imported water and save them money. Then they had this project pretty recently in Pittsburgh, 52 million for WIFIA and around a little over 90 million for the drinking water SRF to work on what they call their water reliability plan. So they're doing a lot of modernization of their infrastructure, hoping that in like future funding for WIFIA and DWSRF, they can replace their existing clear well. So they're working on the first stages of that and doing some water system upgrades currently. Okay, and so just to wrap up, we've thrown a lot at you over the last, I think, 55 minutes. And so thank you all for sticking through this. It's a lot of information. But the takeaways from this are that, you know, the WIFIA program and both SRFs are really beneficial funding options for water infrastructure projects. They might not be the perfect solution for every community, but they can help a lot of communities, either one of them or put together. So WIFIA, again, long loan terms, repayment deferrals up to 5 years. You know, we can offer that master agreement or large upfront commitment of, you know, many hundreds of millions of dollars if that's what's needed to kind of give you funding certainty to implement these huge projects, and that flexible repayment option. SRFs also have a ton of benefits, long loan terms, that lower interest rate, you know, all the way down to 0% in many states, opportunities for grant-like dollars. So individually, they're great programs. Together, they're great programs. Can kind of maximize benefits to communities. They pair well. And like I've mentioned, we have co-funded dozens of projects together and hoping to do dozens more over the next couple of years. Okay, and with that, we are done. I just have this contact us slide with all of our emails if you have questions for us, links to our resources, but I'm not going to go over that, but I just wanted you to know that that's there if you have questions after this. Okay, Jess, I think we're turning it back over to you.
Yes, thank you. That was fantastic. Thank you so much to all three of you, but especially that compare and contrast that you just went over, Dallas. That's precisely the information I was hoping to get out of today's webinar. We have some really good questions here. I'm going to start from the top, so if everyone can be patient, I will get to your question. We have plenty of time. We have a question from Andrew. Are there options available for even smaller communities with a lower threshold? Our system only serves about 150 to 200 people, and we have a project that we are hoping will be less than $1 million.
I can start with this because I think it came in while I was presenting. And then I would probably turn it over to Brad and Allison. So for WIFIA, the small community designation of 25,000 or less is in the law, so we can't do anything about that. The project minimums of 5 or 20 million, depending on the size, are also in the law, so there's nothing we can really do about that. And so I would say unless there are any changes to the law as it's currently written, those are kind of things that we can't get around for the WIFIA program. But I do think that the SRFs could be a good option.
Yes.
For a project of that size.
Yes. Thank you, Dallas. I'm just jumping in to confirm what Dallas was saying at the end. Both clean water and drinking water SRF has funded plenty of small, rural, and disadvantaged communities throughout the country in the past, and are actively doing it. So I would just contact your state SRF and they can help you get the ball rolling, and you might, if it's a drinking water project, you might even be eligible for some of the set-asides.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from Christy. Is there a condition where the 49% local contribution can be reduced for communities that are deemed economically disadvantaged?
I think that one's also for me. And so I will clarify. So that 49% for WIFIA, that is like the maximum amount that we can fund in a loan to you. So again, I keep using 100 million. I know that's a large amount, but like sometimes math is hard. And so 100 million project, you have a $100 million project, we could fund 49 million of that project for you. Like we could give you a $49 million loan. So it's not like a local contribution. You as the borrower would have to come up, you would have to show the WIFIA program that you have or that you can obtain financing for the other 51%. And what we typically see is cash on hand or like cash reserves, the bond market. A lot of our borrowers will go to the bond market. A lot of our borrowers, again, will go to the SRF for either part of it or in certain situations, again, that entire 51%. So yeah, just clarifying that that 49%, it's not like a local contribution. That is what we can loan to you.
Great, that makes sense. Thanks, Dallas. Next up, we have one from Keith. Could you explain the upfront WIFIA fees and what they are based on?
Yes, sure. So I'm just pulling up the question thing so I can read them too, because that helps me. So for WIFIA fees, that's a good question. We have, again, what we call the application fee, but it's really a deposit. And so that the application fee, when you would submit your application, it would be $25,000 for communities of 25,000 or less, $100,000 for communities over 25,000. And again, that is going to be a down payment or like a deposit on your closing costs on the day of loan closing. And so what we typically see when we get to loan closing is the fees are around 150,000 to 250,000. And I say that number, and usually when I see like panic in people's eyes. But what I want to reiterate again is that you've already put a deposit down during the application for part of that. Two, the WIFIA fees, they can be rolled up into your loan. That is an option. And three, it can sound kind of scary when we present it as just like a number, but I wrote the number down in case this came up. So looking at the fees on average compared to the size of the loan, the fees are usually like 0.1% to 0.4% of the loan amount, which I think is very on par with the SRFs and might be lower in certain situations. So, and getting off topic, what they cover, it's kind of it's the cost for the WIFIA program of closing the loan. So like outside legal counsel to kind of write up the loan agreement. If there's any outside like financial advisor assistance that's needed, or maybe engineering assistance that's not really common anymore, that's what would go into that. And so if there's more like legal negotiation that happens with the loan agreement and the terms, like that's going to increase the closing costs. If we do more of the work in-house, which we do for our smaller borrowers to kind of keep those costs as low as possible, that's also, going to impact the closing costs. And so I think I answered all parts of that question.
Yeah, I agree.
Perfect.
Moving on to Mark. Did I hear correctly that I can bundle multiple projects in one application?
I think that might have been me.
That was a
Okay.
New York City example.
Yes, so that was I can speak for Clean Water State Revolving Fund at least. There are several states that do what we call programmatic financing, but it basically is bundling projects into one loan. It's state specific, but you could ask if they have done arrangements like that. So for instance, large treatment plants will come in and put their basically their CIP into their intended projects for the loan, and then they'll make an arrangement over several years sometimes, and then be able to use that money to finance anything on the CIP list that was entered. So it just makes things, it's a little bit more flexible for the treatment plant or for the implementer. And then it just runs a little bit more smoothly on the finance side, I think, too. But yeah, I can pull
Yeah,
a fact sheet that we have, but Brad could speak for DW.
yeah, I'll just jump in. Pretty similar to what Allison just said. It is possible. We call it Profi. We have a fact sheet on it that we can share. Is you would just have to talk to your specific state to see if one, if they allow it, and then two, how to go about pursuing it. Because as Dallas alluded to earlier, like we really are 102 different programs. So nationally, we allow Profi, but to get the specifics, you were happy to speak to your specific state.
Yeah, and I would just say, I know you were asking this, I think, when Allison was talking about the New York City project, but the WIFIA program can also, fund a bundle of projects under one loan. And we do that a lot. So I think that's something that all three programs can do if it's something that the borrower is interested in.
Great, thank you. Moving on, could an SRF loan be used to refinance a WIFIA loan?
Ooh, I've been thinking about that one.
Ooh.
I don't think so. Um,
I'm not sure. The Clean Water
but I'm still
SRF can
contemplating that.
refinance others. That's a good follow-up question.
It is a good follow-up question. I mean, they do have a lot of the same requirements. And I think it might depend if the SRF loan is deemed federal dollars or not federal dollars.
Right.
That
So
one is a tricky one, and I see, Harry, that you asked it, so I want to look into that and follow up with you. I have your email.
it's an interesting question.
I need to
especially
ponder
now with
that
the
one.
rates going up.
I have a similar question. So from the presentation, I garnered that it's common that an applicant would apply for WIFIA funds and SRF funds generally about the same time. The time frame is similar, is that correct?
Yeah, well, I guess it depends again. It depends on the state because there are, many different SRFs. Yeah, I would say a lot of times you can apply at the same time, but the processes are going to be like for WIFIA versus like the state revolving fund are going to be different. So that doesn't mean that you'll close at the same time. I'm trying to think like in a state that we co-fund with, like a lot of our co-funded projects are in a certain state. The SRF loan will usually close around a year after the WIFIA loan closes.
Wow, okay.
It just depends on the state's process and also how the borrower kind of likes to structure it. They can kind of choose which loan they want to do first. And so it doesn't have to be, a certain way or that they have to be done at the same time.
Okay. All right, thanks. All right, back to your questions. From Mark. Trouble with the small community systems are a large number of them are not municipal entities. Hard to give these loans to private owners.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a point that you mentioned.
Yeah, again, I think you're referring more to the SRFs, but Yes, I would say in my time with the SRFs, that was probably one of the biggest challenges, is that while at the EPA, like at the federal level, we allow for the funding of private entities with the SRFs, there are some states who typically, because of the way the state law is structured, can't provide funding for those private entities. And again, a lot of those private entities are small, like you're saying, and so that it makes it harder for them to find assistance that they need to run their water systems.
Yeah, one workaround that over the years I saw is consolidation. Um, Larger public water systems have received DWSRF loans in part to consolidate with surrounding small private systems.
Thanks, Brad. Katie has a question. Are municipalities required to have the 49% remaining funding? I think she finished the question. Before submitting to WIFIA for funding.
Good question. And so yeah, again, WIFIA will do the 49%. That other 51% that's gonna, fund the whole project. You don't have to have already secured it when we get to like the WIFIA loan closing. You just need to have a plan and have shown the WIFIA underwriter and the transaction team that this, if you're going to the bond market, if you're going to the SRF, that like you've applied for an SRF loan, that you've talked to the SRF, and that you have a plan for securing this financing, and that it's likely you'll be able to obtain it. You don't have to actually have already secured it by the time that you close the WIFIA loan. And that's something that the underwriter, they'll work with you on, and kind of structuring that and figuring out like what your financing plan might look like.
Okay, great. Do the WIFIA loans go through the state's bond bank, or are the loans between the borrower and EPA/WIFIA?
Good question. So the loans are actually with EPA, not through the state.
Okay, great. Judith asks, the application asks, what other funding will you be using? Both applications.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, so both SRF and the WIFIA applications ask, what other funding will you be using?
Yeah, at least for WIFIA, yeah. Because we know that you'll have to be using some other funding, and so we start that that conversation at the very beginning, because we need to know how you're going to fund the entire project, since we cannot fund the entire project for you. Yeah, I'm sure that's probably also the case for a lot of the SRFs if they can't fund an entire project, but I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know. I can at least say for the SRFs, you need to identify the repayment source that you'll be using for your loans when you come in for the loan.
Yeah, and I'll just add that the SRFs can fully fund projects, but if you are doing co-funding, that is something that is discussed with the state SRF during the application process. So you'll see some federal co-funding like USDA, and then we also see some non-federal, like different types of state programs, along with the SRFs.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Can you elaborate on, I guess it's SWIFIA? Is this the state acting as the WIFIA applicant? And if so, could the SWIFIA loan be used if a state anticipates many large projects beyond the SRF availability?
Mm-hmm. Good question. Yes, so the WIFIA program, I didn't really talk about that much on here. It's part of the WIFIA program, and that's like a specific subset of money that we set aside to lend directly to the state revolving fund programs. So yeah, it does go to the SRFs. They would, submit an application to us, same as like, a water system or another entity would. And yeah, the main reason would be because they have a huge project list. They're not able to fund all the projects. Maybe the WIFIA deal is going to be, on top of the bond market. If they go to the bond market, maybe it's, a better deal than the bond market. Yeah, and it's just a way for them to have more money so they can help more of the systems in their state. Good question.
But then they would still be held to the requirements of a WIFIA loan, correct? Or the SRF requirements?
No, that's correct. I mean, it helps that above, like by and large, the SRFs and WIFIA have the same requirements. So a lot of the things that those projects would have to do are already things that they would be doing if they were like just getting SRF assistance that like wasn't coming like from the WIFIA program.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. Our city has over 110,000 residents, and I know some of the projects have to be for 25,000 people or less. Could the funding be for a project that only serves an area in the city with 25,000 or less people?
Oh, that's a good question. I am going to say probably no. And it's going to just be based on like that designation of like small community or non-small community would be like based on your service area, not on like the specific project itself.
Okay.
But
thanks.
another interesting question.
Yeah. Our last question right now is from Tim. We are a new municipal water system, so we have no credit history. Would that be an obstacle to securing loans in either program?
I'll go first. For WIFIA, good question. I think it would make it harder. But I will say if it's something, if you want to talk about your project, if you want to talk about WIFIA, always happy to set up a time for you to kind of talk about your water system and like, oh, sorry, there's feedback. Hopefully that's just me. And kind of see like what we can do to kind of work through that. I will say, again, we've talked about like the different stages for the WIFIA loan process. That first stage where you submit that letter of interest, you're not required to submit like an actual credit rating at that time. You can submit like, we call it a pro forma. It's like an Excel sheet where you kind of put in your financial information and projections, and we can kind of do like an initial analysis based on that, and then go from there. So without all the details, I can't say exactly. I do think it would be a little bit harder. But if you're interested in talking, always happy to do that. And then I won't speak to the SRF.
Yes, I'll jump in at least for the drinking water side. If you're a small system and you're newer, it sounds like you might be a candidate for the technical assistance to small water systems set-asides, which is up to 2% of the CAP grants for each state. So this set-aside, it would help with planning and design, capacity assistance, training operators and other water system personnel, while assisting in other federal requirements. So you, in theory, if your community's not ready to receive a loan yet from the state SRF, they can give you, they can work with you with the 2% set asides, help you start building and growing your program. And then perhaps a year later, once you have some more financial institutions working under your feet, you could apply again and possibly receive it. That's kind of what that is, not kind of, that is what the main priority of that set aside is to help newer, especially primarily small communities to meet the threshold of receiving a loan from the government.
I'll just add in really quickly that a feature of both of the programs is something federally called additional subsidization. Well, both of the SRF programs I'm talking about here, additional subsidization, it's a minimum required amount by each state that needs to go to communities that meet affordability criteria that are state affordability criteria. So small and disadvantaged communities that reach a certain threshold within that state will the state offers an amount of usually principal forgiveness on the loan, either a portion of that loan or the full amount that that kind of decreases the amount that you have to repay over the entire portion of the loan. So that's something that to ask about and is a large priority of the bipartisan infrastructure law, with almost half of those funds needing to go towards those communities and other projects. So something to ask the states.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And it is also possible to receive those type of additional subsidy even if your community doesn't necessarily meet the requirement of your state's disadvantaged definition. So either way is a good avenue to look down with your state SRF.
Great, thanks, Brad. You mentioned previously about the technical assistance, and we have a question from Mark. Under USDA programs, there are local entities that provide free technical advice to applicants. Does WIFIA or SRF also provide that kind of assistance? I know you touched upon that you do. I think the question is that assistance free?
Yes, it's a set aside, and again, it's hard to say a universal yes or a universal no because all these programs are unique, but in general it can be, and so it's essentially money that the state has taken out of their cap grants and they're using it to provide this benefit to the communities. And oftentimes the communities are not expected to pay anything back for this service.
Great, thank you. I wanted to point out that Allison has provided a fact sheet in the chat box, a programmatic financing fact sheet for Clean Water SRF on bundling projects into one loan. Everyone can check that out. And I'll do a last call for questions. Do we have any last minute questions from participants? All right, well, the three of you certainly did an amazing job answering those far-reaching questions. I want to give a huge thank you to Dallas, Bradley, and Allison for sharing their expertise with us today. Following this webinar, you will receive a follow-up email with the slides from today and a link to the recording. We also ask that you complete the webinar evaluation following this webinar so you can let us know your thoughts on today's session, as this helps us plan future webinars on topics that are important to you. Thank you again, and we hope to see you at future EFCN events. We've got some great thank yous. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Yes,
Reach out if you have any questions.